Hello, welcome to episode 6 of reading the Silmarillion through Clausewitz. And today we're going to talk about the continuity between Tolkien and Clausewitz on the use of surprises. Now, Clausewitz is skeptical about surprise in war, but Tolkien uses this device a lot. So, what Clausewitz says is that you have tactical surprises and you have strategic surprises. Strategic surprises are very rare. Usually, he says, because of the enormous sort of logistical and organizational lifting that has to happen for any war, both sides totally understand what the shape of the war is, what each is after, more or less how it's going to play out. There's really not much in the way of a strategic surprise. Tactically, there can be, but he says that the investment in trying to pull off some kind of sleight of hand is so large that, as he puts it, surprises are in theory very attractive, but in practice pretty unappealing and very rare. The essence of a surprise, he says, is all about the speed, obviously the unexpected nature of it, and classic example of this in the Silmarillion is the Battle of Sudden Flame. Now, this is a tactical surprise, but it has big strategic payoff. The siege of Angband has been going on for about 400 years. There's a leaguer, as Tolkien likes to use that word, a leaguer of elves and men. And they've basically encircled Angband, except it's not a pure encirclement because of the nature of the mountains. Sauron and various Melkor and various forces can sneak out. But what happens is that Melkor deploys a new weapon, a volcano. Basically, what happens is that a volcano erupts right underneath the feet of the encircling forces, and what happens is what surprise, says Clausewitz, is meant to do. It shatters cohesion, and as the cohesion falls, then obviously the friction rises. So the forces of the elves and the men are in complete disarray. The strategic payoff is to break that alliance, right? To break the siege. But it's deeper than that, right? It's not just breaking the siege; it's literally breaking it apart. The sort of the elves and the men. Now, Melkor is a master of the tactical surprise, right? He uses it a lot, whether that's the unleashing of Balrogs, the unleashing of dragons in the War of Wrath, or actually even, that's the first passage I'll talk to you about, the unleashing of Sauron. So here's how Tolkien puts that. So it's literally 2 years after the Battle of Sudden Flame, right? Which basically just, just completely like evaporates, the people who are caught up in that, it's really grim. So this is on page 155 of Silmarillion. And he says, for nigh on 2 years after the Battle of Sudden Flame, the Noldor still defended the Western Pass. About the sources of the Sirion, for the power of Ulmo was in the water, right? So here they're they're backstopped by the power of the gods, by the power of the Valar. And Minas Tirith withstood the orcs. But at length, after the fall of Fingolfin, and we'll come back on that, Sauron, greatest and most terrible of the servants of Morgoth, who in the Sindarin tongue was named Gorthar, came against Orodeth, the warden of the tower upon Tall Sirion. Sauron was become now a sorcerer of dreadful power, master of shadows and of phantoms, foul in wisdom, cruel in strength, misshaping what he touched, twisting what he ruled, lord of werewolves, his dominion was torment. So this is the deployment, right, of a new weapon. And of course, the legacy of Sauron will be to constantly put pressure on the cohesion of the forces of the West. And of course, ultimately, Gandalf will be sent to kind of face off against Sauron. But Tolkien uses tactical surprises quite a lot. So Bilbo uses the ring as a weapon against Smaug. Aragorn brings out the army of the dead, and that actually is quite an interesting example, because that's a certain example of what Clausewitz calls a true surprise. The very best kind of surprise, if you can pull it off, is what he calls a surprise in the distribution of forces, right? When like a really significant military body turns up all of a sudden. And that is, of course, what happens with the army of the dead. So, there's another example, right? So both sides, in this struggle are using this idea. And then we come to sort of what's really sort of fascinating. If there is a surprise, then Clausewitz says your only recourse is the military virtues. Because the surprise is designed to shatter cohesion, then what you need to rely upon, he says, is the boldness of your soldiers. So the boldness then stands as a kind of a center of cohesion that resists the onslaught of the surprise. And it could be, I don't know, right? It could be that Clausewitz is thinking of a passage in Caesar's Gallic Wars, because Caesar literally gives the example of the surprise and then the boldness of his army. So what's happened in the Gallic Wars is that Caesar is going up against the Nervii, and Caesar's kind of moving forward. Quite a cautious, bold for sure, but quite cautious Caesar. But nonetheless, he gets surprised, and the Nervii sort of make a rush at the army. And here's what's said about it. So this is the Gallic Wars. I love these landmark classics. Or not classics, just the landmark Julius Caesar. Tremendous, with all maps and beautiful, brilliant. So anyway, what happens is, this is in Gallic War 2. Caesar gave only the most urgent orders, then hurried to whatever unit happened to be closest to urge on the troops, and ran into the 10th Legion, right, the beloved 10th. All he said briefly to his men was to take courage, to keep in mind their traditional valor, boldness, not to panic, and to resist the enemy's charge bravely, right? So there's the shock of the surprise. What's going to hold it? What's going to keep the cohesion? Rely upon your traditional valor. And then what happens is the army, so this is now Caesar reflecting on sort of the battle dispositions, the army was drawn up not so much in the formation prescribed by military principles and order, right? So he's been taken by surprise, but more according to the demands imposed by the natural features of the site, the hill's slope, and the exigencies of the current emergency, the surprise. The legions were far apart from one another, and each resisted the enemy in a different part of the battlefield. as we have noted above, very dense hedges were in the way and obstructed the view, so that it was impossible to allocate reserves for specific purposes or even to recognize what was needed and where, or to exercise some form of unified and central command. Right? So that's it. Clausewitz says that what a surprise does, it breaks the connection between command and the unit. Perfectly described here. So what's left? Well, it's actually what Caesar goes on to say. What happens is that the soldiers, they start taking matters into their own hands. They start seeing what they like, literally in the kind of the close encounter. They start seeing what the situation is. They start to move some of the cohorts together. You know, the sort of like centurions on the ground. They start operating as the command structure, and the soldiers, they don't panic. They rely upon their training. They rely upon their past victories, and we'll come to that actually. So well, do it now. So here, how do you become bold? So Clausewitz says, by success on the battlefield, or by the school of hard knocks, by toil, burden, extreme physical conditions. And Caesar was a kind of a tough commander, strenuousness. I mean, despite the fact they're fighting a lot as well, right? But he was always about the kind of like, keeping people at it, like building bridges across the Rhine for a couple of weeks and then taking it down and stuff like that. I mean, so it is just what Clausewitz says. That's why I wonder whether Clausewitz has been very attentive to that passage, and sure enough, you find it in Tolkien. Okay, so. What happens at the Battle of Sudden Flame is what Clausewitz says happens. That a surprise, surprises, as we can see, the Nervii, they've definitely got the Romans on the back foot, but the Romans will prevail. So Clausewitz's basic point is the upfront effort in trying to pull off the surprise is barely worth it, because like every military encounter, the surprise is no different. It runs into friction. And in this case, the friction of the volcano opening up are the other mountains. And this is actually wonderfully spoken about by Tolkien. So he says, so you've got to imagine that, right? The besiegers are just completely shattered by this volcano opening up. But he says, and because of the strength and height of the shadowy mountains, which withstood the torrent of fire, and by the valor, the boldness of the legions, the boldness now, the valor of the elves and the men of the north, which neither Orc nor Balrog could yet overcome, Himluth remained unconquered, a threat upon the flank of Morgoth's attack. So, on the one hand, Morgoth has created the surprise. It's been extraordinarily devastating. But the friction, the mountains in this case, means that a critical strategic stronghold remains for the Noldor, and they are now on the flank of Morgoth's attack, and obviously that's an extreme threat to Morgoth. Okay, so but as the story unfolds, what happens is that Barahir's people, they're basically annihilated. Some survive. Barahir sends off his wife and the other families, the children. They go deeper into the mountains, and Barahir remains with the 12 that includes Beren. And what Clausewitz says is that for a military to have boldness, they must be, as he puts it, they must have been through arduous circumstances or battle. They must have been made into a guild. And you see this, of course, later on in The Lord of the Rings with the Dunedain are a kind of a guild. Of course, the fighting Uruk-hai are a kind of a guild. But the Barahir's men, they become a guild. And they live as outlaws, right? They live just up on the mountains. They're constantly hunted. Slowly but surely, they are whittled away. And then finally, they are eliminated, and only Beren survives. And then what Beren does, right? He has a kind of exactly what Clausewitz would predict. His growth in sort of military prowess is as a consequence of hardship. So if I can, I will read something. This is from page 164. So this is all part of the Battle of the Sudden Flame and its aftermath. The aftermath includes the emergence of yet another tactical surprise in the case of Sauron. And here now Beren is sort of alone and really beginning to take on this sort of stature. So page 164, beyond lay the wilderness, where the sorcery of Sauron and the power of Melian came together, and horror and madness walked, right? So this place where two shadowy forces are meeting, right? And it creates a kind of a bewilderment. There, spiders of the fell race of Ungoliant, she's back, abode, spinning their unseen webs in which all living things were snared, and monsters wandered there that were born in the long dark before the sun, hunting silently with many eyes. No food for elves or men was there in that haunted land, but death only. That journey is not accounted least among the great deeds of Beren, but he spoke of it to no one after, lest the horror return into his mind. So there is the toil, builds the boldness of Beren, right, which is going to be so critical, right? Basically the story of Beren and Luthien, right? One could almost categorize that in its kind of military aspect as a story of boldness, right? And we see, how this is sort of being generated in the case of Beren. But it's not Beren alone. And so just to kind of finish, let me point you towards two other places where you see this idea of toil and hardship generating the virtue, the military virtue of boldness. So the Noldor, the house of Fingolfin, and this is going to be connected because I want to close this by talking about Fingon. But the house of Fingolfin, they are separated from the house of Feanor. Feanor betrays them. Feanor takes the boats to go over to Middle Earth, and instead of bringing the rest with him, he burns the boats so that the other Noldor are stranded. And then this leads to the march across the ice, right? So this is page 90. So then Fingolfin, seeing that Feanor had left him to perish or return in shame to Valinor, because you recall what happens, they disobey the gods. This is the sort of the beginning of all the implications of the the oath of Feanor. So he could return in shame to Valinor and was filled with bitterness. But he desired now as never before to come to Middle Earth and to find Feanor. And he and his host wandered long in misery. So they wandered long in misery, but their valor and endurance grew with hardship. That's it. That's exactly what Clausewitz says. For they were a mighty people. They were the elder children of God. And not yet weary. They were not yet weary with the weariness of the earth, right? This is sort of how we're going to meet Elrond, right? He's at the sort of the bitter end of this weariness, right? The fire of their hearts was young, and led by Fingolfin and his sons, which is going to include Fingon, and by Finrod and Galadriel, they dared to pass into the bitterest north, and finding no other way, they endured at last the terror, the cruel hills of ice. Few of the deeds of the Noldor thereafter surpassed that desperate crossing in hardihood or woe. So, just like Beren engages in a task of hardiness, it builds his boldness, and it is one of the great, in the annals of the history of Middle-earth, it is one of the great moments. Same here, same thing. Hardship generates the valiant. It is legendary. And we get one of the payoffs is when Fingon goes to rescue Medros. So Medros has been captured by Melkor. He's poor guy. He's the guy hanging from the cliff face, held on by his wrist, just sort of left to sort of suffer eternally, right? And so here's what happens. Melkor has cast a kind of a dark cloud over the mountain, where his fortress is, and over the surrounding lands to sort of confuse the enemy and to keep everything obscure. It's very Clausewitzian, right? That in war, the most critical thing to have is information. And you see that, right, in the Caesar passage, right? Caesar couldn't see what was going on, right? Because he wasn't in as he says, right, the battle happened in a place that we would not pick by military logic. And so he had no vision for command. But what happens is that Fingon uses that to his advantage, right? So it's another good case, right, where, the Dark Cloud is not exactly a tactical surprise. Let's just say it's a tactic. But as a kind of pursuing our theme, right, as a kind of a surprise, then it shows its friction, because it's used by the enemy, Fingon in this case, to kind of squirrel his way into the zone of control that is Melkor's fortress area. And then what happens, right? So this is on page 109, on to page 110, and this will be the last thing we talk about today. Then Fingon the Valiant. Okay, so, because remember, right, he's, of the previous thing I just read, right, he's come out of the terror of the high ice. And so he is the Valiant, resolved to heal the feud that had divided the Noldor. So he's hoping for a strategic victory. He wants to help Medros, the son of Feanor, and by helping him to reunite the house of Noldor, so they can then develop a common front. And it more or less works, but not perfectly. just because the Feanor's crew, they're just burdened by that oath. So he resolved to heal the feud before their enemy should be ready for war. For the earth trembled in the Northlands with the thunder of the forges of Morgoth underground, right? So they know war is coming. Long before, in the bliss of Valinor, before Melkor was unchained, or lies came between them, Fingon had been close in friendship with Medros. So the two wings of the Noldor. And though he knew not yet that Medros had not forgotten him at the burning of the ships, the thought of their ancient friendship stung his heart. Therefore, he dared, bold, he dared a deed which is justly renowned among the feats of the princes of the Noldor. Alone and without the counsel of any, he set forth in search of Medros, and aided by the very darkness that Morgoth had made, he came unseen. Right? So there's the tactical surprise. He can't actually accomplish it by himself. The eagles have to come and help him, but nonetheless. Now, I said at the start that strategic surprises were unusual. But I also said that Tolkien loves a surprise. And it is really interesting that there are two strategic surprises, well, at least that I could think of, right off the top of my head, but I could think of them, that capture, especially, well, it captures Melkor. Melkor and Sauron make the same mistake. They think that the Valar, that they're out of it. They don't think there's any way that they're going to get involved. And it does capture them. It takes them by surprise when it happens. So we'll just finish with that, actually, because I had wanted to talk about that. So on page 251, we see Melkor being surprised by the emergence of the Valar coming to help the forces of good. So, bottom of page 250, onto 251. Yet it is said that Morgoth looked not for the assault that came upon him from the west. So he doesn't look for it, right? So he's surprised. For so great was his pride, become that he deemed that none would ever again come with open war against him. Moreover, he thought that he had forever estranged the Noldor from the lords of the West, and that content in their blissful realm, the Valar would heed no more the world, right? So there's a strategic surprise that the Noldor, that the Valar make a return. And of course, it does destroy Melkor. So that's what Clausewitz says. The reason strategic surprises don't really happen is because in the build-up for war, both sides kind of more or less know what's going on. They have pretty good knowledge of what's afoot. But here, Melkor simply doesn't really think it's possible. And actually, there is a reason given, right? He says, so the Valar get involved again from pity. For to him that is pitiless, the deeds of pity are ever strange and beyond reckoning. But the host of the Valar prepared for battle, right? So really nice confirmation of the Clausewitzian idea that the disposition of forces is the very best of surprises. It's very rare, seldom strategic, but here an explanation is given for how how Melkor fails to see the strategic situation has shifted against him. Then, equally, you see it with Sauron. So if you go to page 290, so Sauron has tricked the Númenóreans into going to war against the gods. But he too suffers a strategic surprise. So it says about, on page 290, it says of Sauron, and there he abode until at last by his craft he had corrupted the hearts of most of that people, the Númenóreans, and set them at war with the Valar, and so compassed their ruin, as he had long desired. But that ruin was more terrible than Sauron had foreseen, for he had forgotten the might of the lords of the West in their anger. Now, I'm laughing, but this is shocking what happens, right? I mean, the gods just kill the Númenóreans. They're all gone. The world was broken and the land was swallowed up, right, in the great wave. And the seas rose over it. And Sauron himself went down into the abyss. So what's the surprise? The strategic surprise is Sauron simply did not conceive of the very possibility that the gods, in their anger, would simply annihilate the Númenóreans. Wow. Right? No, I mean, just completely, obviously taken aback by that. So, I hope you've enjoyed this looking at the problem of surprise and the way that boldness is the antidote, right? So, most theoretically, surprise breaks cohesion. That increases friction. What is it that boldness does? Boldness gets cohesion to return. Right? That's in the most formalistic way of talking about that. Examples that I gave included Caesar. I think he may have been a place that Clausewitz is going to for some sort of thoughts about this. And just the numerous cases. First, the numerous cases of surprise in Tolkien and the numerous ways in which hardship generates boldness, and this boldness then has important military effects as predicted by Clausewitz. Okay, everyone, thanks very much.